Wanda.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with everybody because I think it's a feeling of déjà vu, isn't it? You know, companies were offering their services to the government to produce PPE months and months ago. The hotels are offering their services. Time and time again, we hear business stepping in and saying, we know how to do this. We know how to make ventilators. We have spaces in our hotels. And the government dithering about it or not accepting the offer so that they are forced to go onto the media and say, actually, we're trying to help. We're really trying to pull together. So I think the real problem is we are just not learning the lessons. We're nearly a year into this, and we're seeing a cycle of recurring actions happening because the government is reacting far too late, and the horse is bolted, and the stable door is firmly closed.
Oliver, lots of points being made in your direction, a number of them including people crossing borders in order to come to the UK.
I think that the first point to appreciate with all of this is...
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting issue, isn't it? Because, there's a double jeopardy for Black and Asian communities and for communities in deprived areas, because we know our country has one of the highest levels of inequality. And we know that in countries with high levels of inequality, we also see higher levels of poor mental health, poor physical health, obesity, teenage pregnancy, lower levels of trust and lower levels of social mobility, higher levels of crime. But what COVID has really shown us over the last year is that whenever there is a shock, an economic shock or a health shock, it's the poorest communities that suffer most. And that is why we absolutely have to tackle health inequalities at the heart of this, which are disproportionately suffered by our Black and Asian communities.
And how can they be encouraged to take advantage of the vaccines? I mean, we know from documents released by SAGE, for example, that over 70% of Black Britons were unlikely or very unlikely to have the vaccine.
Well, I think there's a lot of different combinations of factors here. There's a lot of misinformation, and there was a study a poll that showed that even doctors were not necessarily taking up the vaccine as well. So it's not just confined to Black and Asian minority communities. But there's also a distrust and a mistrust of authorities, which is hardly surprising when, the authorities have tried to send our grandparents back to the Caribbean in terms of Windrush, or when our communities are being deported, or when we're being portrayed as, drug dealers, gang members and prostitutes on TV. So it's not really surprising. And when we have a higher rate of stop and search that's been absolutely abused under COVID. So it's not really surprising that those relationships with authorities are not one necessarily of trust. And I think that's really a shame, because we are seeing inequality increased even more, because disproportionately, Black and Asian people are working in those frontline occupations. So when the ONS stats showed the higher rates of COVID were among frontline healthcare staff, people working in factories, we know that those are the sorts of jobs, the low income but absolutely essential jobs that many people in our communities are working in. So if they are doubly disadvantaged by the structural racism and institutional racism and inequalities that our country has been rife with for decades, and they don't have the vaccine as well, we're going to see these inequalities increase even more.
Wilfred?
Well, I think this is just emblematic of a far bigger problem, and that is the fact that profit is put above people, and it's that simple. And we learnt that at those tragic events in Grenfell. And, people think health and safety isn't very sexy. But you know what? There's a reason for health and safety. There's a reason for that. And the cuts to the health and safety executive, all of these cuts, all of these shortcuts, all of these tenders, all of these opportunities for businesses to come in with the lowest possible tender to be taken up. This isn't just about business. This is about people like Natalie. This is about all of those sleepless nights. And when we look at the industry, I'm sure you'll remember a couple of years ago, the head of Persimmon was getting a £75 million bonus. Now, they wanted to give him £110